now we'll go on with Caroline, who will give us her view on, root causes and whether fighting root causes is the correct approach or fighting itself is the problem, and whatever Europe means by fighting or states being addressed by asylum seekers like Australia, and what border management means.
Thank you so much, and allow me this opportunity to thank the organizers for inviting me. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation. I have a paper written in form of a journalistic piece. Not because I'm a journalist, but when you get to work on migration, displacement every day, then there are those realities that you'd like to piece together in an effort to truly communicate. Before I start, allow me to highlight certain aspects that the speaker before me alluded to, and that is we have observed still a reality of more interest in humanitarian funding than in funding for development. Please bear that in mind as I take us through my narration. And in the last up to 5 years, we've seen up to 30% of food ration cuts for refugees in the Dadaab camp of Kenya. So when the government of Kenya announced a rather controversial decision to close Dadaab, it was not a surprise to many of us, because their point was we are increasing vulnerabilities of people who are already vulnerable. And so it was really a rally to the international communities and all players to refocus more on, I don't use the term crisis, but to a situation of displacement that has already been going on for the last 2 decades. And just as a reminder, and one of the reasons I do not use the term crisis when speaking migration or displacement is that I come from a region, the Horn of Africa, that hosts more than 6 million refugees, and we've never called that a crisis. The private sector is important as we speak about the development nature of addressing displacement alongside, of course, humanitarian action. And it did not escape many of us that the refugee chief was in Davos, and so many humanitarian actors appealing to that very crucial segment of society towards investing more in refugees, because that's what they are calling for. And finally, these are just my tidbits, is on the EUTF and Valletta. As the speaker before me mentioned, it's still too early to really say what the impact of this is, but on the ground, even before any monitoring or evaluation has been done, is that many African countries are quite disappointed. But again, from my point of view, there is a feeling on the ground that the African countries have also not been very serious about the commitments they made in Valletta. On to my paper, and I call it Addressing Root Causes of Migration and Externalization of Borders, an Implementation Fallacy. An intergovernmental conference took place in December 2018 in the beautiful Moroccan city of Marrakesh and adopted the Global Compact on Migration, or the GCM, as it has come to be fondly called. Against this background, the New York Times reported on 6th December that the migrant crossing through the Red Sea has seen a significant increase, more than the crossings and arrivals in Europe through the central Mediterranean. This is backed by migrant flow monitoring conducted by the UN Migration Agency, IOM, using their collaborative data collecting tool known as the Displacement Tracking Monitoring. I read this on my way from a small dusty migrant city of Obok in Djibouti, probably the biggest part of the puzzle in the migration flows on the eastern route to Yemen. And therefore, the New York Times reporting did not come as a surprise at all. The Horn of Africa and agencies that work in that region have long engaged, collected data, and analyzed trends and communicated the realities of migrants, often mixed, who take the journey eastwards. And when I talk about mixed migration, it's because in a group of people that are moving, they have all sorts of reasons as to why they left home. And that also explains the graying of the fact whether one is a migrant or one is a refugee, and we see a lot of that. We see refugees who leave Kenya, Ethiopia, because there are no opportunities, and then turn migrants on their way to Europe. The biggest of the numbers on the eastern route, up to 92%, are young men of up to 25 years from Ethiopia. It's not a country in conflict. Somalia follows closely with only a few Eritreans on the route. And I'm aware that Eritreans are one of the largest number of asylum seekers in Germany from the Horn of Africa. Whereas Somalis receive prima facie recognition and grant of asylum in Yemen, the same does not apply to Ethiopians. Many will actually not be seeking asylum, stating clearly that the reason for embarking on this perilous journey is largely economic. There are different crossing points towards Yemen. It's in Puntland region of Somalia, Somaliland, but the most significant is this tiny dusty town called Obok in Djibouti. Just before Christmas last year, I drove from Djibouti city through Tajura into Obok, a distance of 328 kilometers. And so young men walking along the tarmac on the incredibly harsh terrain and temperatures of up to 40 degrees Celsius, often without water in the scorching sun. They keep closer to the road with the hope to get the occasional hitchhike, water from travelers and neighboring settlements, and as protection from animals and any other threats that may be found more inland, of which the rough terrain would be enough for most of us. Often their journeys are facilitated, as they choose to refer to smugglers, and the transportation is a mix of long treks and use of private and public transportation. One young man told me that he paid an equivalent of $1,000 or thereabout for his journey up until Djibouti from Ethiopia. If one makes it there safely, and many often die in the dry conditions due to starvation and dehydration, the wait for smugglers, or facilitators as they call them, to enable their onward crossing by boat to Yemen begins. There are those whose families will support their dreams by paying for the crossings. Migrants I spoke to in Obok during the trip reported that 45 of those they had left home with had departed the previous night by boat, since their families had paid the money to the smugglers. They were waiting, hoping, and trying to make some money to raise the required further up to $1,500 for the crossing for what is a 3 hours boat journey. While to the authorities and the rest of us, smugglers are criminals engaging in transnational organized crime, the migrants see them as the facilitators and a bridge to their dreams. They provide a service, a much needed one at that, despite reports of torture, including throwing migrants overboard on approaching the shore, electrocution, as was recounted to me by a 13-year-old evacuee from Yemen, and a few years back, kidnapping for organ removal. Many of these migrants speak to a lack of any perspective for the future, indicating that the amount paid for the journey of up to $2,500 is a necessary investment. Are they aware of the dangers? Absolutely. They have heard from those who went before them, have previously experienced themselves, as is the case of a migrant who reported having just been deported from Saudi Arabia 3 weeks before our conversation and was already back on the trek. Why? I asked him. On his previous attempt, he had found employment on the Yemeni-Saudi border, trading in khat, a nicotine-filled chew herb popular in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. He claimed to have made up to $1,000 per month and had been rounded up in the ongoing crackdown on irregular migrants in Saudi Arabia and deported. He therefore could not see any other way of getting the kind of income he was making before his deportation. Asked if he was willing to be assisted to return home, he feared that he had nothing to return to. We spoke to the possibility of support towards establishing a business or training towards a skill that can help him fend for himself and his family. That had him thinking and speaks to the need to truly address reasons of flight, which often include a lack of hope to improve one's situation in the present and future. Stringent border control by itself will not offer a solution to the governance of migration. As a matter of fact, it has only made migration more dangerous and left the smugglers with more money in their pockets. This is reported by migrants on their journeys to the Middle East and northwards towards Europe. Withdrawal of life-saving vessels in European waters, very controversial, may have seen a slight drop in arrivals on Europe's shores for now, while at the same time making smuggling more lucrative, more lives lost, and more people in deportations in countries that are unwilling or unable to uphold protection of human rights. This against a continent and humanity that speaks to standing up for human rights. Some of the current collaborators on the African continent on migration control, in quotes, are states that are known for blatant human rights violations against their own people. But on the migration front, partners look the other way and engage them as gatekeepers. Another reality is that the other migration routes, for instance that down to South Africa or Yemen and Saudi Arabia, have seen a considerable increase on numbers against a European crackdown. For perspective, the fact that there is an ongoing conflict in Yemen has not acted as a deterrent for migrants destined there or transiting towards Saudi Arabia. The responses that address such a deep-seated risk-taking has to be convincing, almost life-changing. It has to involve families while addressing structural issues that contribute to the lack of access to livelihood opportunities, addressing conflicts for a significant number of young people, mostly men, in the Horn of Africa where I come from. Border patrols alone, and I keep repeating this, will not address the challenge of irregular migration towards Yemen or northwards towards Europe. Addressing the individual, community, and structural drivers of migration is ultimately the better way to address irregular migration in a sustainable manner. This requires collaboration and partnerships with more than traditional migration actors, which are, where I come from, ministries of interior. This should include local and international development actors, peace and humanitarian actors. The desired outcome will not happen overnight, but over time. We have the potential to move towards more safe, orderly, and regular migration that benefits the migrant, communities of origin, and those of destination. A drop in numbers by itself of arrivals is not enough, nor an indication of a human rights-based migration governance regime as espoused in the Global Compact on Migration. The GCM therefore presents countries with opportunities to cooperate to address irregular migration as well as facilitate orderly and safe migration. This global, non-binding framework is being seen by many, especially in Africa, as having the potential to create more partnerships, strengthen data collection and application by governments in making evidence-based policies and ultimately contributing to the attainment of the dream of the Sustainable Development Goals of truly leaving no one behind. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for this very impressive insight into what happens when borders are closed and what happens when people need to be smuggled or facilitated.